Grandma, Dad wants you to sign everything away to him. My 16-year-old granddaughter whispered into her phone, not knowing I was standing right outside her bedroom door. He says it's for your own good, but Mom thinks you're getting too old to handle your own affairs. I stood frozen in the hallway of my own home, hearing my son and daughter-in-law plotting to strip me of everything I'd worked 50 years to build. What I did next with my will and property deeds left them scrambling to explain themselves to authorities they never saw coming. I'm here to share my story with you, and I hope you'll stick around until the end to see how this all played out. Please comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale of family betrayal and ultimate justice has traveled. My name is Beatrice Nakamura, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about family loyalty. I never imagined that the greatest betrayal of my life would come not from strangers, but from the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise and the daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into our family with open arms. I live in the small town of Millfield, Oregon, about 30 miles outside of Portland, in a house that represents every dream my late husband Kenji and I ever shared. We bought this modest craftsman bungalow on Birchwood Avenue back in 1978 when Kenji was working at the lumber mill and I was teaching third grade at Millfield Elementary School. The house wasn't much to look at then: peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that leaked during Oregon's notorious winter rains, but we saw its potential. For 27 years, Kenji and I poured our hearts and every spare dollar into that house. We rebuilt the kitchen ourselves, learning plumbing and electrical work from library books and helpful neighbors. We restored the original hardwood floors board by board, working evenings and weekends until our backs ached and our hands were raw. We planted the garden that became the pride of our neighborhood: Japanese maples that now tower 30 feet high, rose bushes that bloom in cascades of pink and white every spring, a vegetable garden that still produces more tomatoes and cucumbers than I know what to do with. When Kenji died of a heart attack at 68, 7 years ago now, that house became more than just my home. It became my sanctuary, my connection to the love we'd shared, and the most valuable thing I owned. The property values in our neighborhood had skyrocketed as Portland expanded and young professionals discovered the charm of small-town Oregon living. What we'd bought for $45,000 in 1978 was now worth close to $750,000 according to recent real estate assessments. But the house's financial value was never what mattered most to me. Every room held memories of the life Kenji and I had built together. The kitchen where we'd cooked thousands of meals side by side, the living room where we'd watched our son Hiroshi take his first steps, the master bedroom where we'd held each other through good times and bad, where I'd nursed Kenji through his final illness, where I'd learned to sleep alone after 42 years of marriage. Hiroshi was our miracle baby, born when I was 35 after years of heartbreak and failed pregnancies. He was everything Kenji and I had dreamed of: intelligent, curious, kind-hearted. We'd scrimped and saved to make sure he had every opportunity we'd never had. Piano lessons when he showed musical talent, summer camps when other kids were getting jobs, a college education at Portland State University that we paid for by taking second mortgages and working extra shifts. He'd met Rebecca during his sophomore year, and she seemed perfect for him at the time. She was studying business administration, came from what appeared to be a good family in Seattle, and made Hiroshi happy in ways we hadn't seen before. They married right after graduation in a beautiful ceremony that cost us more than we could afford, but we gladly paid because we wanted their special day to be perfect. For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed ideal. Hiroshi got a good job as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Portland. Rebecca found work in marketing at a tech startup. They bought a small house in Beaverton, started talking about children, and seemed to be building the kind of stable, happy life that every parent wants for their child. Their daughter Mika was born when they'd been married 5 years, followed 2 years later by their son Daniel. I threw myself into grandmotherhood with all the joy and energy I'd been saving up. I babysat whenever they needed me, taught the children to garden and cook, filled photo albums with pictures of every milestone and achievement. When Kenji got sick, Those grandchildren were the light that kept me going through the darkest days of watching my husband fade away. After Kenji's funeral, Hiroshi and Rebecca became increasingly attentive to my needs. At first, I was grateful for their concern. The house felt enormous and empty without Kenji's presence, and the daily tasks of maintaining property that we'd once managed together seemed overwhelming for one person. When Hiroshi offered to help with yard work and home repairs, I welcomed his assistance. When Rebecca suggested I join them for Sunday dinners every week, I was touched by her thoughtfulness. But gradually, their helpfulness began to feel more like supervision. Hiroshi started arriving unannounced, using the key I'd given him for emergencies, walking through my house and making notes about things that needed attention. A loose board on the porch steps, a dripping faucet in the guest bathroom, gutters that should probably be cleaned. Each observation was presented as evidence that the house was becoming too much for me to handle alone. Rebecca's involvement was more subtle but equally persistent. She'd call multiple times a week, ostensibly to chat, but the conversations always circled back to concerns about my well-being. Was I eating properly? Taking my medications on time? Remembering to lock the doors at night? Her questions felt caring on the surface, but underneath was the implication that I might not be managing these basic tasks adequately. 6 months after Kenji's death, they began suggesting that I consider downsizing to something more manageable. "Mom," Hiroshi would say, using the gentle tone he'd adopted since his father's passing, "this house is a lot of work. Maybe it's time to think about a nice senior community where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep." The idea horrified me. I wasn't ready to give up the home Kenji and I had spent decades creating together. I was 66 years old, in good health, perfectly capable of living independently. Yes, some tasks were more challenging now that I was alone, but I could hire help for heavy work, and I had neighbors who were always willing to lend a hand when needed. But Hiroshi and Rebecca persisted. They started bringing me brochures for retirement communities, scheduling tours I hadn't requested, and speaking to me in the patient, slightly condescending tone people use with children or individuals they consider incapable of making good decisions. When I expressed reluctance to visit these facilities, they'd exchange glances that clearly communicated their belief that I was being unreasonable and stubborn. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Hiroshi would say, using the gentle tone he'd adopted since his father's passing. "This house is a lot of work. Maybe it's time to think about a nice senior community where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance and upkeep." The idea horrified me. I wasn't ready to give up the home Kenji and I had spent decades creating together. I was 66 years old, in good health, perfectly capable of living independently. Yes, some tasks were more challenging now that I was alone, but I could hire help for heavy work, and I had neighbors who were always willing to lend a hand when needed. But Hiroshi and Rebecca persisted. They started bringing me brochures for retirement communities, scheduling tours I hadn't requested, and speaking to me in the patient, slightly condescending tone people use with children or individuals they consider incapable of making good decisions. When I expressed reluctance to visit these facilities, they'd exchange glances that clearly communicated their belief that I was being unreasonable and stubborn. "We just want what's best for you, Mom," Rebecca would say, her voice dripping with false concern. "Living alone at your age isn't safe. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? What if you forgot to turn off the stove and started a fire?" These scenarios seemed wildly exaggerated to me. I'd been taking care of myself and others for over 70 decades without any major disasters. I was still driving safely, still managing my finances, still maintaining friendships and participating in community activities. The portrait they were painting of me as a confused, helpless, elderly woman bore no resemblance to the reality of my daily life. But their campaign continued
relentlessly. Every small mistake I made, forgetting where I'd put my reading glasses, being a few minutes late for a doctor's appointment, needing to ask them to repeat something I hadn't heard clearly, was treated as evidence of cognitive decline. They'd started speaking about me in the third person when they thought I couldn't hear them, discussing my condition and what we needed to do about it. 2 years ago, the financial manipulation began in earnest. Hiroshi convinced me to add him as a joint holder on my checking account, explaining that it would make it easier for him to help with bills and expenses if I ever became ill or incapacitated. It seemed like a reasonable precaution at the time, and I trusted him completely. He was my son, after all, and he'd been handling his own finances responsibly for years. But once he had access to my account, I began noticing irregularities. Small amounts would disappear without explanation. $200 here, $500 there. When I asked about these transactions, Hiroshi always had reasonable explanations. He'd used my card to buy groceries for me and forgotten to mention it. He'd paid for a repair on my house and withdrawn the money to reimburse himself. Each individual incident seemed harmless, but the pattern was troubling. Around the same time, Rebecca ramped up her pressure campaign regarding my living situation. She'd found what she called the perfect assisted living facility, Sunset Gardens, a gleaming new complex on the outskirts of town that marketed itself as luxury senior living. The monthly fees were astronomical, nearly 3 times what I spent on all my current living expenses combined. But Rebecca dismissed my concerns about the cost. "You can afford it, Mom," she'd say, as if she had detailed knowledge of my financial situation. "The house is worth so much now, and you have Kenji's life insurance and your retirement savings. You should be enjoying your golden years instead of worrying about home maintenance and property taxes." What Rebecca didn't seem to understand, or chose to ignore, was that I was enjoying my golden years. I loved my house, my garden, my independence. I had close friends in the neighborhood, a routine that brought me comfort and purpose, and memories in every corner of my home that connected me to the life I'd built with Kenji. The idea of abandoning all of that to live in an institutional setting, no matter how luxurious, filled me with dread. But my resistance to their suggestions was increasingly being framed as stubbornness, or worse, as evidence of diminished capacity to make rational decisions. They'd started having whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. They'd exchange meaningful looks when I expressed preferences they disagreed with. Most disturbing of all, they'd started talking to my doctor, my neighbors, and my friends about their concerns regarding my mental state and ability to live independently. Dr. Patricia Yamamoto had been my physician for 15 years, and she knew me well enough to recognize that I was mentally sharp and physically capable. But during my last visit, she'd mentioned that Hiroshi had called her office to discuss his worries about my memory issues and poor judgment. She'd assured him that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, but the fact that he'd gone behind my back to plant seeds of doubt with my medical provider was deeply disturbing. Mrs. Eleanor Martinez, my next-door neighbor and friend for over 20 years, had also been approached by Rebecca with concerns about my declining condition. Eleanor had told me about the conversation, her voice filled with confusion and indignation.
"Beatrice," she'd said, "that daughter-in-law of yours asked me to keep an eye on you because she's worried you're not taking care of yourself properly. She wanted me to report back to her if I noticed anything concerning. I told her she was being ridiculous. You're one of the most capable people I know. But she insisted I didn't understand how serious the situation was becoming." The realization that Rebecca was systematically contacting people in my life to build a case for my incompetence was chilling. She was laying the groundwork for something, creating a narrative that would justify whatever action she and Hiroshi were planning to take. My suspicions were confirmed 3 months ago when I overheard a phone conversation between Hiroshi and someone I assumed was a lawyer. I'd been in my garden, weeding the flower beds near the living room window, when his voice had carried clearly through the screen. Yes, we're concerned about her capacity to make financial decisions, he'd been saying. She's showing signs of confusion and poor judgment. We think it would be in her best interest if we could get power of attorney to help manage her affairs. Power of attorney. The phrase had sent ice water through my veins. If they succeeded in convincing a court that I was mentally incompetent, they could take control of all my assets, sell my house, and make decisions about my life without my consent. Everything Kenji and I had worked for would be at their mercy. I'd forced myself to remain calm, to continue weeding as if I hadn't heard anything unusual, but my mind had been racing. How long had they been planning this? Had they already consulted multiple lawyers? Were there documents being prepared that I didn't know about? That evening had marked a turning point in how I viewed my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. I'd started paying closer attention to their words and actions, looking for signs of the manipulation I now suspected was taking place. And once I knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere. Every suggestion that I was becoming forgetful or confused, every offer to help with my finances or simplify my living situation, every conversation with people in my life about their concerns for my well-being. It was all part of a coordinated campaign to establish that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their scheming. They'd assumed that because I was elderly, I was also naive and helpless. They'd underestimated the woman who had taught elementary school for 37 years, managing classroom after classroom of energetic children while dealing with parents, administrators, and constantly changing educational requirements. They'd forgotten that I'd raised a child largely on my own, while Kenji worked long hours at the mill, making countless decisions about everything from medical care to college planning. They'd overlooked the fact that I'd been Kenji's primary caregiver during his final illness, navigating complex medical systems and insurance requirements while providing round-the-clock care. Most importantly, they'd failed to realize that spending 40-plus years as an educator had taught me how to recognize deception, how to gather evidence, and how to build a case when someone was trying to manipulate the system. I might be 73 years old, but I was far from defenseless. That's what had brought me to Mika's bedroom door on that fateful October evening. I'd been visiting for our usual Sunday dinner, trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy while observing their behavior with my newly suspected eyes. After dinner, Mika had gone upstairs to work on a history project about World War II internment camps, a topic that had particular resonance for our family, given that Kenji's parents had been detained during the war. I'd offered to help her with the project, having done extensive research on the topic over the years and collected oral histories from Kenji's relatives who had lived through that difficult period. But as I'd climbed the stairs to her room, I'd heard her talking on the phone, and something in her tone had made me pause outside her door. "I know it sounds weird," she'd been saying to someone on the other end of the call, "but my parents have been talking about this for months. They think Grandma Beatrice is losing her mind or something." My blood had run cold. Even the grandchildren were being drawn into this narrative about my supposed mental decline. "Dad keeps saying she's getting confused about money and forgetting important things," Mika had continued. "Mom thinks she's too old to live by herself anymore. They want her to sign papers that would let them make decisions for her." And then had come the words that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. "Grandma, Dad wants you to sign everything away to him. He says it's for your own good, but Mom thinks you're getting too old to handle your own affairs." I'd pressed my back against the hallway wall, hardly daring to breathe as my 16-year-old granddaughter unknowingly confirmed my worst fears. They weren't just planning to manipulate me into signing over power of attorney. They were already so confident in their scheme that they were discussing it openly in front of the children. The house is worth like $750,000 now, and I'd realized that they'd been researching the property value, probably planning how to liquidate my assets once they gained control. Dad says if they can get Grandma into that senior place, they can sell the house and use the money to pay off their credit cards and maybe buy a bigger house for us.
The casual way she'd mentioned their debts and their plans to use my money to solve their financial problems had taken my breath away. This wasn't about concern for my well-being. This was about using my assets to fund their lifestyle upgrade while hiding behind a veneer of filial duty and elder care. "I feel bad for Grandma," Mika had said, and for a moment I'd felt a flutter of hope that at least one family member saw through their manipulation. "She seems fine to me, and she loves that old house so much, but Dad says her brain is going and she just doesn't realize it yet." The hope had died instantly. Even my granddaughter, who had no reason to doubt her parents' assessment, was being convinced that her mentally sharp grandmother was suffering from cognitive decline. They were poisoning the entire family against me, creating a unified narrative that would make their eventual takeover seem not just justified, but necessary. I'd backed away from Mika's door as quietly as possible, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and heartbreak. The people I'd loved most, sacrificed most, trusted most, were plotting to steal everything I'd worked for, while convincing themselves and others that they were acting out of love and concern. As I'd made my way back downstairs, I'd looked at Hiroshi and Rebecca with completely new eyes. Hiroshi, sitting in my living room reading a magazine, acting like the devoted son who would never dream of betraying his mother's trust. Rebecca, loading the dishwasher in my kitchen, playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law who only wanted what was best for the family matriarch. But now I could see through their performance to the calculating minds beneath. Every concerned comment about my forgetfulness, every suggestion that the house was becoming too much for me, every offer to help with my finances, it had all been building toward this moment when they would present me with legal documents designed to strip me of my autonomy and my assets. "Everything all right, Mom?" Hiroshi had asked as I'd entered the living room, looking up from his magazine with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You look a little tired." "Just getting older, I suppose," I'd replied, testing the waters to see how they'd respond to any acknowledgement of aging on my part. "Maybe you should think about taking it easier," Rebecca had immediately chimed in from the kitchen. "At your age, it's important to not overdo things. That house is a lot of responsibility for one person." There it was again, the constant drumbeat of messaging designed to convince me that I was too old, too frail, too confused to manage my own life. But now I understood it wasn't loving concern driving these comments. It was a deliberate strategy to wear down my confidence and prepare me to accept their help as inevitable. I'd excused myself early that evening, claiming fatigue and a slight headache. As I'd hugged them goodbye, a gesture that now felt like embracing wolves in sheep's clothing, I'd been struck by the complete disconnect between their warm smiles and their cold intentions. The drive home to my house on Birchwood Avenue felt surreal. Everything looked the same. The familiar streets of Millfield, the neighbors' houses I'd been looking at for over 40 years, my own driveway with the cherry tree Kenji and I had planted to celebrate Hiroshi's high school graduation. But I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes, understanding for the first time how precarious my hold on this life really was. That night, I'd lain in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd sacrificed everything to educate and launch into successful adulthood, was planning to repay that investment by stealing my home and my independence. The daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into our family, supported through difficult times and trusted with my grandchildren, was orchestrating a scheme to convince the world that I was mentally incompetent. But as the shock wore off, it was replaced by something else: determination. I might be 73 years old, but I was Beatrice Nakamura, daughter of immigrants who had survived discrimination and hardship, widow of a man who had overcome the trauma of family imprisonment to build a successful life, mother of a child I'd raised to value honesty and loyalty,
even if he had apparently forgotten those lessons. I'd spent decades teaching children, which meant I knew how to spot deception, how to gather evidence, and how to build a case when someone was trying to manipulate the system. I had navigated complex medical and insurance bureaucracies during Kenji's illness, which meant that I understood how to work with lawyers, doctors, and other professionals when necessary. Most importantly, I had something Hiroshi and Rebecca apparently didn't expect: the financial resources to fight back. The house they were so eager to liquidate wasn't my only asset. Kenji's life insurance, my teacher's pension, and our joint savings account gave me the means to hire the best legal help available if necessary. As dawn had broken over Millfield that morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be a victim in this story. I wasn't going to passively allow my son and daughter-in-law to steal my life's work while pretending to act out of love and concern. I was going to fight back, and I was going to win.
But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I needed to gather evidence of their scheme, document their lies and manipulation, and build a case that would not only protect my assets, but expose their betrayal for what it truly was. The woman they thought they could manipulate and control was about to show them exactly who they were dealing with. And by the time I was finished, they would understand that underestimating Beatrice Nakamura had been the biggest mistake of their lives. The morning after I discovered my son and daughter-in-law's betrayal, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of confusion and self-doubt they'd been deliberately cultivating was finally lifting, and I could see my situation with perfect, painful precision. But to understand how I'd gotten to this point, how the people I'd trusted most had been able to manipulate me so systematically, I need to tell you about the life I'd built and the values that had guided me for over 7 decades. My story begins long before that devastating phone conversation I overheard. It starts in 1951, when I was born to Tomoko and Hiroshi Sato in a small farming community outside of Sacramento, California. My parents were second-generation Japanese Americans who had lost everything during World War II when they were forced into internment camps. Like many families of their generation, they'd emerged from that experience with a fierce determination to rebuild their lives and prove their loyalty to a country that had treated them as enemies. My father worked 16-hour days as a farm laborer, moving from ranch to ranch with the seasons, picking strawberries, lettuce, and grapes under the scorching California sun. My mother took in sewing and laundry, her fingers flying over fabric late into the night to earn every penny she could. They lived with the constant fear that their hard-won progress could be taken away at any moment, that some new crisis or prejudice could destroy what little security they'd managed to create. From the earliest age, I understood that education was our family's pathway to stability and respect. "Study hard, Beatrice-chan," my mother would say in her mixture of English and Japanese, as she helped me with homework after finishing her own exhausting day of work. "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take away from you." My parents spoke often about the importance of family loyalty and taking care of your elders. In Japanese culture, caring for aging parents wasn't just an obligation, it was a sacred duty that defined your character and honor. I grew up watching my mother send money to her elderly parents in Japan, even when we barely had enough for our own necessities. I saw my father work extra shifts to pay for his widowed mother's medical care, never complaining about the sacrifice involved. These values shaped every decision I made as I grew up. I excelled in school, earning scholarships that allowed me to become the first person in my family to attend college. I studied elementary education at San Jose State University, driven by a desire to help children the way dedicated teachers had helped me. I lived in the cheapest dormitory, worked multiple part-time jobs, and graduated with highest honors while sending small amounts of money home to help my parents whenever I could. It was during my senior year that I met Kenji Nakamura, a quiet, serious young man studying engineering at the same university. His family story was remarkably similar to mine: immigrants who had lost everything in the camps, parents who had worked themselves to the bone to rebuild their lives, a son who carried the weight of family expectations and dreams on his shoulders. Kenji and I understood each other in ways that went beyond words.
We both knew what it meant to be grateful for opportunities, to never take stability for granted, to understand that hard work and sacrifice were the prices of security. When we married in 1973, it felt like joining forces with someone who shared not just my love, but my values and my understanding of what mattered most in life. We moved to Millfield, Oregon in 1975, drawn by Kenji's job offer at Pacific Lumber Company and the chance to buy our first home in a community where we could put down real roots. The house on Birchwood Avenue wasn't much to look at, a 1940s craftsman bungalow with good bones but decades of deferred maintenance. But it represented everything we dreamed of, our own piece of America, a place where we could build the stable, prosperous life our parents had sacrificed to make possible. Those early years in Millfield were challenging but filled with hope. I taught third grade at Millfield Elementary School, working with children who reminded me daily of why education mattered so much. Kenji put in long hours at the lumber mill, coming home exhausted but proud of the honest work that paid our mortgage and put food on our table. We spent weekends transforming our house room by room, learning skills our parents had never had the luxury to develop because they'd been too busy surviving. The community of Millfield in the 1970s was small, tight-knit, and predominantly white. Kenji and I were among the few Asian families in town, which meant we faced occasional prejudice and always had to work a little harder to prove we belonged. But we were determined to build relationships with our neighbors, to contribute to the community, to show by example that we were Americans who deserved respect and acceptance. I threw myself into school activities, volunteering for every committee and fundraiser, organizing cultural exchange programs that helped students learn about different backgrounds and traditions. Kenji joined the volunteer fire department and coached Little League Baseball, demonstrating through his actions the values of service and community involvement that defined American citizenship in our minds.
For years, we struggled with infertility, watching friends and colleagues start their families while we endured disappointment after disappointment. We saw specialists in Portland, tried every treatment available in the late 1970s, and gradually accepted that we might never have the children we desperately wanted. The house that we'd imagined filling with the laughter and chaos of a large family remained quiet, furnished with hopes that seemed increasingly unlikely to be fulfilled. When I finally became pregnant at age 35, it felt like a miracle. Hiroshi was born in March of 1986, a healthy, beautiful baby who represented every dream Kenji and I had ever shared. We named him after my father, honoring the man whose sacrifices had made our American dream possible. From the moment I held him in my arms, I knew that this child would receive every opportunity, every advantage, every expression of love that we could possibly provide. Raising Hiroshi became my greatest joy and my most important responsibility. I continued teaching while he was young, but I structured my entire life around his needs and development. I read to him every night, helped with homework every afternoon, attended every school event and sports game. Kenji and I saved money for years to buy him a piano when he showed musical interest, drove him to lessons an hour away in Portland every week, and proudly attended every recital and performance. We lived modestly so that Hiroshi could have experiences we'd never dreamed of as children. Summer camps that cost more than my parents had earned in a month, educational trips to historical sites and museums, music lessons, art supplies, sports equipment, and books, anything that might nurture his talents and expand his horizons. When it came time for college, we mortgaged our house to cover the costs that scholarships didn't provide. We wanted Hiroshi to graduate without debt, to start his adult life with the freedom to pursue his dreams rather than being constrained by financial obligations. Watching him walk across the stage at Portland State University to receive his accounting degree was one of the proudest moments of our lives. Hiroshi's marriage to Rebecca in 2004 initially filled us with joy. She seemed intelligent, ambitious, and genuinely caring toward our son. She came from a middle-class family in Seattle, had a college degree in business administration, and appeared to share our values about hard work and family responsibility. When they bought their first house in Beaverton, a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a safe neighborhood with good schools, we felt confident that they were building the kind of stable foundation that would support a happy marriage and successful family life.
The birth of our grandchildren, Mika in 2007 and Daniel in 2009, brought new meaning to our lives. I embraced my role as grandmother with the same dedication I brought to every other aspect of family life. I babysat whenever Rebecca and Hiroshi needed help, taught the children to garden and cook, filled photo albums with pictures of every milestone and achievement. Kenji, despite his naturally quiet nature, came alive around the grandchildren, teaching them to fish and build birdhouses, sharing stories about his own childhood that he'd rarely discussed with anyone else. For several years, our extended family functioned beautifully. We had regular Sunday dinners at our house or at Hiroshi's and Rebecca's home. We celebrated holidays together, took family vacations to the Oregon coast, and created the kind of close-knit family bonds that I'd always dreamed of having. The children were thriving in school, Hiroshi's accounting career was progressing steadily, and Rebecca seemed content with her part-time work in marketing that allowed her to be home when the children needed her. But even during those happy years, I noticed subtle signs that Rebecca's priorities might be different from ours. She was always beautifully dressed, even for casual family gatherings, in clothes that clearly cost more than I would ever spend on myself. Her house was decorated with expensive furniture and accessories that seemed to be updated frequently, as if keeping up with the latest trends was a priority. She often mentioned other families they knew, comparing their homes, cars, vacations, and children's activities in ways that suggested she was constantly measuring their lifestyle against others. I tried to dismiss these observations as generational differences. Rebecca was younger, more style-conscious, more aware of social expectations than I had been at her age. If she wanted to spend money on clothes and home decor, and they could afford it, what was the harm? Kenji and I had been raised to value thrift and practicality. But perhaps our daughter-in-law simply had different ideas about how to enjoy the prosperity that Hiroshi's education and career had made possible. The first real warning sign came about 5 years into their marriage, when Rebecca began making comments about our house that felt subtly critical. Nothing directly insulting, but observations that made it clear she viewed our home as outdated and insufficient. "This neighborhood is so quiet," she'd say, as if the peaceful tree-lined streets of Millfield were a negative rather than a positive feature. "Don't you ever think about moving somewhere with more amenities?" She'd ask why we didn't update our kitchen to match modern styles, why we kept furniture that was so old-fashioned, why we didn't take advantage of our home's equity to finance improvements that would bring it into the 21st century. Her suggestions were always framed as helpful advice from someone who understood real estate and home values, but underneath was the clear implication that our choices reflected poor judgment or lack of sophistication.
When Kenji was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in 2015, everything in our world shifted. The man who had been my partner, my best friend, my rock for over 40 years, suddenly became someone who needed constant care and monitoring. His energy disappeared almost overnight. The projects around the house that he'd always handled became impossible for him to manage. The long walks we'd taken every evening for decades became too much for his failing heart to sustain. I threw myself into caring for Kenji with the same dedication I'd brought to every other important task in my life. I learned to monitor his medications, manage his diet, recognize the signs of dangerous fluid retention that could signal a crisis. I drove him to countless medical appointments, sat with him during hospital stays, and gradually took over all the household tasks that we'd once shared. During this difficult period, Hiroshi and Rebecca's support was a source of great comfort. Hiroshi would stop by several times a week to help with yard work and home repairs that Kenji could no longer handle. Rebecca would bring dinner occasionally, call to check on us regularly, and help coordinate Kenji's medical care when the complexity of treatments and appointments became overwhelming. Looking back now, I can see that this was when their campaign to position themselves as my primary caretakers really began. But at the time, their involvement felt like genuine family support during a crisis. When Hiroshi suggested that they help manage some of our financial responsibilities to reduce the stress on Kenji and me, it seemed like a reasonable way to ensure that important bills were paid on time, even when we were dealing with medical emergencies. When Rebecca offered to research home health services and senior support programs that might help us navigate Kenji's care, I was grateful for her business background and organizational skills. When they both encouraged us to make sure our legal documents were up to date and easily accessible, it felt like responsible planning for an uncertain future. Kenji died on a Tuesday morning in March of 2017, his heart finally giving up after years of valiant effort. I was holding his hand when he passed, and his final words were about how proud he was of the life we'd built together and how much he trusted me to continue taking care of our family. The funeral was beautiful, attended by hundreds of people whose lives we'd touched during our 44 years in Millfield. Former students, colleagues from school and the lumber mill, neighbors and friends filled St. Paul's Methodist Church to capacity, sharing stories about Kenji's kindness, work ethic, and quiet dignity. In the weeks following the funeral, I felt completely lost. The house that had been full of our shared life suddenly felt cavernous and empty. Every room held memories that were both comforting and heartbreaking. The silence was overwhelming after decades of companionable conversation and shared routines. That's when Hiroshi and Rebecca's increased involvement in my daily life began to feel less like support and more like management. They had keys to my house, which I'd given them during Kenji's illness in case of medical emergencies. But now they were using those keys to arrive unannounced, walking through my home and making mental notes about things that needed attention. A loose handrail on the front steps became evidence that I might fall and injure myself. A small leak under the kitchen sink was proof that I wasn't maintaining the house properly. When I mentioned that I'd forgotten to pay the electric bill on time, something that had happened exactly once in the chaos immediately following Kenji's death, it was treated as a sign that I was becoming confused about financial responsibilities. Rebecca, in particular, began to position herself as the family expert on my well-being and needs. She'd researched grief counseling services, senior activity programs, and support groups for widows, presenting me with brochures and information as if I were incapable of identifying resources for myself. When I expressed preference for processing my grief privately and maintaining my independence, my choices were dismissed as denial or stubbornness. "Mom," she'd say, having adopted the maternal title shortly after Kenji's death, "it's not healthy for you to isolate yourself like this. People your age need social interaction and structured activities to maintain their mental health." The constant messaging about people my age and what we supposedly needed or couldn't handle began to wear down my confidence in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. Every minor mistake or moment of sadness was treated as evidence that I was struggling more than I realized. Every expression of independence or different opinion was met with patient explanations about why my thinking might not be as clear as it used to be. 6 months after Kenji's death, they convinced me to add Hiroshi to my checking account as a joint holder. The reasoning seemed sound. If I had a medical emergency or became temporarily incapacitated, he'd need access to funds to ensure I received proper care. It felt like a practical safety measure, and I trusted my son completely. But once Hiroshi had access to my account, I began noticing irregularities that troubled me. Money would disappear without explanation, sometimes small amounts, sometimes several $100s. When I asked about these transactions, Hiroshi always had reasonable explanations. He'd paid for a repair on my house and forgotten to save the receipt. He'd bought groceries for me and used my card rather than his own. Each individual incident seemed harmless, but the pattern was concerning.
Around the same time, Rebecca began her campaign to convince me that my house was too much for someone my age to handle alone. She'd point out every minor maintenance issue as if it were evidence of dangerous neglect. A loose board on the back deck, a dripping faucet in the guest bathroom, gutters that needed cleaning. Each problem was presented as proof that I was no longer capable of maintaining my own home safely. "We're worried about you, Mom," she'd say in that concerned tone that I now understand was carefully calculated. "This house requires so much upkeep, and you're trying to manage it all by yourself. What if you got hurt trying to fix something?
What if you forgot to maintain something important and it caused damage or safety problems? Her solution was always the same. I should consider moving to a senior living community where professional staff would handle all maintenance and provide the social interaction and structured activities that someone in my situation apparently needed. She'd researched several facilities in the area, all of them expensive, all of them designed to appeal to seniors who had significant assets to liquidate in exchange for care and convenience. The most persistent target of her advocacy was Sunset Gardens, a new assisted living facility that marketed itself as luxury senior living, but cost more per month than I'd ever spent on housing, food, and utilities combined. Rebecca would bring brochures for Sunset Gardens, schedule tours I hadn't requested, and speak about the facility as if moving there was an inevitable next step rather than one option among many. "You'd have so many activities and social opportunities," she'd enthuse, showing me photos of craft rooms and exercise classes filled with smiling elderly residents. "No more worrying about cooking or cleaning or home maintenance. You could just focus on enjoying your retirement and spending time with friends." What Rebecca didn't seem to understand, or chose to ignore, was that I was enjoying my retirement. I loved my house, my garden, my independence. I had close friends in the neighborhood who checked on me regularly. I volunteered at the library and the community center, activities that gave me purpose and social connection. The idea of abandoning everything familiar to live in an institutional setting, no matter how luxurious, held no appeal for me. But my resistance to their suggestions was increasingly being framed as evidence of poor judgment or cognitive decline. When I insisted that I was capable of living independently, it was treated as denial. When I expressed attachment to my home and community, it was dismissed as emotional thinking that prevented me from making rational decisions about my future. Most disturbing was the way they began to involve other people in their campaign to convince me that I needed their intervention. Dr. Yamamoto started receiving calls from Hiroshi about his concerns regarding my mental state and ability to live alone. My neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, was approached by Rebecca with warnings about my declining condition and requests to monitor me for signs of confusion or unsafe behavior. Even my closest friends began to receive subtle messages about how worried Hiroshi and Rebecca were about my well-being. Grace Patterson, who had taught alongside me for 15 years before retiring, mentioned that Rebecca had called her to discuss strategies for helping seniors accept the reality of their limitations. Margaret Coleman, my friend from church, said Hiroshi had asked her to encourage me to consider more appropriate living arrangements for someone of my age and circumstances. The systematic nature of their campaign became clear when I started paying closer attention to these conversations. They weren't randomly expressing concern to people in my life. They were deliberately building a case, establishing a record of my supposed incompetence that could be used to justify more drastic interventions later. 3 months ago, I overheard the phone conversation that confirmed my suspicions about their ultimate goal. I'd been working in my garden, weeding the flower beds near the living room window, when Hiroshi's voice had carried clearly through the screen. "Yes, we're concerned about her capacity to make financial decisions," he'd been saying, to someone who was clearly a lawyer or legal advisor. "She's showing signs of confusion and poor judgment. We think it would be in her best interest if we could get power of attorney to help manage her affairs." Power of attorney. The phrase had sent ice water through my veins. If they succeeded in convincing a court or legal authority that I was mentally incompetent, they could take control of all my assets, sell my house, and make decisions about my life without my consent or input. That evening had marked the true beginning of my awakening to what was really happening. I'd started observing Hiroshi and Rebecca with the analytical skills I'd developed during 37 years of teaching, looking for the patterns and motivations behind their behavior. And once I knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere. Every suggestion that I was becoming forgetful or confused. Every offer to help with my finances or simplify my living situation. Every conversation with people in my life about their concerns for my well-being. It was all part of a coordinated strategy to establish that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. 3 months ago, I overheard the phone conversation that confirmed my suspicions about their ultimate goal. I'd been working in my garden, weeding the flower beds near the living room window, when Hiroshi's voice had carried clearly through the screen. "Yes, we're concerned about her capacity to make financial decisions," he'd been saying, to someone who was clearly a lawyer or legal advisor. "She's showing signs of confusion and poor judgment. We think it would be in her best interest if we could get power of attorney to help manage her affairs." Power of attorney. The phrase had sent ice water through my veins. If they succeeded in convincing a court or legal authority that I was mentally incompetent, they could take control of all my assets, sell my house, and make decisions about my life without my consent or input. That evening had marked the true beginning of my awakening to what was really happening. I'd started observing Hiroshi and Rebecca with the analytical skills I'd developed during 37 years of teaching, looking for the patterns and motivations behind their behavior. And once I knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere. Every suggestion that I was becoming forgetful or confused. Every offer to help with my finances or simplify my living situation. Every conversation with people in my life about their concerns for my well-being. It was all part of a coordinated strategy to establish that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs.
But they'd made several crucial mistakes in their scheming. First, they'd assumed that because I was elderly, I was also naive and helpless. They'd forgotten that I'd spent nearly 4 decades managing classrooms full of energetic children while dealing with parents, administrators, and constantly changing educational requirements. They'd overlooked the organizational and analytical skills that had made me successful as an educator and effective as Kenji's caregiver during his final illness. Second, they'd underestimated my financial resources. The house they were so eager to liquidate represented only a portion of my assets. Kenji's life insurance, my teacher's pension, and our joint savings accounts gave me the means to hire excellent legal representation if necessary. I wasn't a helpless elderly woman dependent on their support. I was someone with options and resources they apparently didn't fully understand. Most importantly, they'd failed to recognize that their systematic lies and manipulation had created a paper trail that could be used against them. Every conversation they'd had with my doctor, every contact with my neighbors and friends, every document they'd encouraged me to sign could be examined and analyzed by professionals who understood elder abuse and financial exploitation. As I'd processed all of this information over the past few months, I'd felt my grief and confusion being replaced by something much more powerful: determination. I wasn't going to be a victim in this story. I wasn't going to allow the people I'd loved and supported to steal the life I'd built with Kenji. But I also wasn't going to act rashly or emotionally. If I was going to fight back against their scheme, I needed to be strategic, methodical, and absolutely certain of my facts. I needed to gather evidence, document their lies, and build a case that would not only protect my assets, but expose their betrayal for what it truly was. That's what had brought me to that fateful October evening when I'd overheard Mika's phone conversation. I'd been visiting for our usual Sunday dinner, observing their behavior with my newly suspicious eyes, looking for more evidence of the conspiracy I now knew was unfolding around me. The conversation I'd overheard had confirmed my worst fears while also providing me with crucial information about their timeline and strategy. They weren't just planning to manipulate me into signing over power of attorney. They were already so confident in their scheme that they were discussing it openly with the children and making plans for how to use my assets once they gained control. But what they didn't know was that their supposedly confused, incompetent target had been documenting everything, building her own case, and preparing for a confrontation that would expose their manipulation while protecting the life and independence they were trying to steal. The 73-year-old woman they thought they could easily manipulate was about to remind them exactly who they were dealing with, and the lesson they were about to learn would be one they'd never forget. Now that you understand my background and how deeply I'd trusted my family, I need to show you exactly how Hiroshi and Rebecca's manipulation escalated over the months following my discovery of their true intentions.
What I initially dismissed as isolated incidents of concerning behavior revealed itself to be a sophisticated, systematic campaign designed to strip away my confidence, independence, and ultimately my assets. The morning after I overheard Mika's phone conversation, I woke with a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Kenji's death, the fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my thinking was completely gone. I could see my situation with perfect, painful precision. But I also realized that if I was going to protect myself effectively, I needed to understand exactly how their manipulation had been working and document every aspect of their scheme. I started that very day by creating what I came to think of as my evidence journal, a detailed record of every interaction, every suspicious incident, every attempt to undermine my confidence or autonomy. I used a composition notebook I'd found in my old teaching supplies, the same kind I'd used for lesson planning during my career. If I was going to build a case against my own family, I would do it with the same methodical approach I'd brought to educating children for 37 years. The first thing I documented was the financial irregularities I'd noticed since Hiroshi had been added to my checking account. When I sat down with 6 months of bank statements and really analyzed the transactions, the pattern was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Money had been disappearing regularly, sometimes $200, sometimes $500, occasionally as much as $800, always with explanations that seemed reasonable at the time but made less sense when viewed as a whole. According to Hiroshi's various justifications, he'd supposedly bought groceries for me 17 times in 6 months, despite the fact that I did my own shopping weekly and rarely needed emergency supplies. He'd claimed to pay for house repairs that I had no memory of requesting or authorizing. He'd withdrawn cash for emergencies that were never clearly defined or documented with receipts. When I added up these unauthorized withdrawals, the total came to over $4,200 in just 6 months. This wasn't casual borrowing or occasional help with expenses. This was systematic theft disguised as family assistance. And the most infuriating part was how Hiroshi had presented each incident as evidence of my confusion or forgetfulness when I questioned the missing money.
"Don't you remember, Mom?" he'd say with that patronizing patience I now recognized as manipulative. "We talked about this last week when your kitchen faucet was leaking. I told you I'd fix it, and we agreed I'd use your account to buy the parts." When I couldn't recall conversations that may never have happened, my uncertainty was treated as proof of my declining mental capacity rather than evidence of his deception. The second pattern I documented was the way Rebecca had been systematically contacting people in my life to build a narrative about my supposed incompetence. I spent several days calling friends, neighbors, and acquaintances to ask about any conversations they'd had with my family members about my well-being. What I discovered was a coordinated campaign that had been going on for over a year. Mrs. Martinez, my next-door neighbor for 20 years, revealed that Rebecca had approached her multiple times with concerns about my safety and confusion. Rebecca had asked her to watch for signs that I was neglecting my property, forgetting important tasks, or behaving in ways that might indicate cognitive decline. She'd specifically requested that Mrs. Martinez report back to her if she noticed me doing dangerous things like using a ladder, operating power tools, or having trouble with basic household tasks. "I thought it was sweet that she was so concerned about you," Mrs. Martinez admitted, "but some of her questions seemed odd, like when she asked if I'd noticed you wandering around outside at unusual hours, or if you'd ever seemed confused about what day it was. I told her you were one of the sharpest people I knew, but she kept insisting that elderly people often hide their problems well." Grace Patterson, my former teaching colleague and longtime friend, had received similar approaches from both Hiroshi and Rebecca. They'd called her multiple times to discuss strategies for helping aging family members accept reality about their limitations. Rebecca had specifically asked Grace to encourage me to consider more appropriate living arrangements and to avoid enabling my denial about my supposed need for assistance. They made it sound like you were in complete denial about some serious health problems, Grace told me. Rebecca said you were refusing to acknowledge memory issues and making dangerous decisions about your living situation. She asked me to help convince you that independence wasn't worth risking your safety. Dr. Yamamoto's office had received multiple calls from Hiroshi expressing concern about my mental state, my ability to manage medications properly, and my capacity to make sound medical decisions. He'd requested that the doctor monitor me for signs of dementia, depression, or other conditions that might impair my judgment. Most disturbingly, he'd asked to be notified if I ever came to appointments alone, suggesting that I might need a responsible family member present to ensure I understood and followed medical advice properly. Even my pastor, Reverend Thompson, at Millfield Methodist Church, had been contacted by Rebecca with concerns about my spiritual well-being during this difficult period of adjustment after Kenji's death. She'd suggested that my resistance to their helpful suggestions might be a form of depression or denial that required pastoral counseling and intervention. The scope of their campaign was breathtaking. They had systematically contacted virtually everyone in my social network to plant seeds of doubt about my competence and create a unified narrative that I was struggling more than I realized or admitted. They position themselves as the concerned, responsible family members who are trying to help someone who is too proud or confused to accept the assistance she desperately needed. But the most insidious aspect of their manipulation was how they'd used my own values and personality against me. They knew I was proud of my independence, so they framed that independence as dangerous stubbornness. They understood my attachment to the home Kenji and I had built together, so they presented that attachment as emotional reasoning that prevented sound decision-making. They recognized my desire to avoid burdening others, so they made every request for help seem like evidence that I was becoming a liability. During the weeks following my discovery of their scheme, I began paying much closer attention to the specific language and techniques they used during our interactions. What I observed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so destructive. Rebecca, in particular, had perfected the art of the concerned suggestion that wasn't really a suggestion at all. She would present her ideas as natural conclusions that any reasonable person would reach, making disagreement seem irrational or stubborn. Mom, I was talking to a friend whose mother just moved to Sunset Gardens, and she's so much happier there. She said her mother was resistant at first, but now she can't imagine why she waited so long to make the change. It's amazing how much easier life becomes when you don't have to worry about all the responsibilities of home ownership. When I couldn't conversations that may never have happened, my uncertainty was treated as proof of my declining mental capacity rather than evidence of his deception. When I expressed reluctance to consider such a move, Rebecca would respond with gentle persistence that made my position seem unreasonable. I understand that change is scary, especially at your age, but sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that end up being the best for us in the long run. We just want what's best for you, and we're worried that you're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be.
The phrase, "at your age," appeared in virtually every conversation we had. Rebecca wielded it like a weapon, a constant reminder that my chronological age automatically disqualified me from making certain decisions or maintaining certain capabilities. At your age, it's so important to prioritize safety over independence. At your age, you really shouldn't be taking unnecessary risks with home maintenance. At your age, cognitive changes can happen gradually without people realizing it. Hiroshi's approach was more subtle but equally manipulative. He would present himself as the reluctant voice of reason, someone who hated to impose but felt obligated to address concerns for my well-being. His technique was to identify minor problems or mistakes and magnify their significance until they seemed like evidence of serious decline. The loose handrail on my front steps, which had been slightly wobbly for months without causing any problems, became a major safety hazard that required immediate attention.
When I mentioned that I'd been meaning to tighten the screws, Hiroshi treated this as proof that I was no longer capable of identifying and addressing maintenance issues promptly. "Mom, what if you'd fallen because of that handrail?" he'd say, his voice heavy with concern. "What if you'd been seriously injured and couldn't get to the phone? We can't have you living with these kinds of safety risks. It makes us worry constantly about what might happen when we're not here to check on you." When I offered to hire a handyman to address the repair, my solution was dismissed as inadequate. "The problem isn't just this one issue," Hiroshi would explain patiently. "It's that there are always going to be things like this coming up, and you're not going to be able to stay on top of all of them. At some point, you need to think about whether it makes sense to keep trying to maintain a house that's becoming too much for you to handle." They had perfected a technique I came to think of as manufactured helplessness. They would identify tasks or responsibilities that I managed perfectly well on my own, then gradually insert themselves into those processes while suggesting that I was struggling more than I realized. My medication management became a particular focus of their concern. I had been taking the same 3 prescription medications for years: blood pressure medication, a low-dose aspirin for heart health, and calcium supplements recommended by my doctor. I used a simple pill organizer to sort them by day of the week, a system that had worked flawlessly for years. But Rebecca began expressing worry that I might be making mistakes with my medication routine. She'd ask detailed questions about when I took each pill, whether I ever forgot doses, and how I kept track of when to refill prescriptions. When I answered honestly that I occasionally forgot to take my morning pills until afternoon, something that happens to people of all ages, she treated this as evidence of dangerous confusion that required intervention. "Mom, medication errors are one of the leading causes of hospitalization for seniors," she'd say with grave concern. "What if you accidentally took a double dose or forgot whether you'd taken your blood pressure medication? These aren't things you can afford to be casual about at your age." Her solution was to take over responsibility for filling my pill organizer each week, a service I neither needed nor wanted. When I declined her offer and explained that I was perfectly capable of managing my own medications, my independence was characterized as stubborn pride that was putting my health at risk. "I know you want to feel independent," Rebecca would say, "but sometimes the most important thing is making sure you're safe. We love you too much to just stand by and watch you take unnecessary risks with your health." The same pattern played out with my financial management, my driving, my social activities, and virtually every aspect of my daily life. They would identify areas where I functioned independently, suggest that my age made those functions dangerous or difficult, offered their assistance as a solution, and then frame my refusal of help as evidence of poor judgment or denial about my limitations. What made their manipulation particularly effective was how they presented themselves as reluctant but responsible family members who were being forced to make difficult decisions because I was no longer capable of making sound choices for myself. They weren't controlling or greedy. They were loving children who were trying to protect their aging mother from her own poor judgment. This narrative was reinforced every time they spoke to other people about my situation. They would express sadness about my declining condition, worry about my refusal to accept help, and frustration with my stubborn insistence on maintaining independence at the expense of safety. Anyone who heard these conversations would naturally conclude that they were dealing with a difficult elderly woman who was too proud or confused to accept necessary assistance from caring family members. But the most sophisticated aspect of their manipulation was how they used my own reactions against me. When I became frustrated with their constant suggestions and criticisms, they treated my irritation as evidence of mood changes associated with aging. When I questioned their version of events or challenged their characterizations of my abilities, they presented my pushback as defensiveness that proved they'd touched on sensitive but accurate assessments of my limitations.
"We understand this is hard to hear," Hiroshi would say when I objected to his suggestions that I was becoming forgetful or confused. "No one wants to acknowledge that they're not as sharp as they used to be, but denial isn't going to help you stay safe and healthy. We're trying to have these conversations now, while you can still participate in planning for your future, rather than waiting until choices have to be made for you." The implication was clear. I could cooperate with their assistance while I was still competent enough to have input,
Or I could continue resisting until my incompetence became so obvious that decisions would be made without my consent. Either way, their control over my life was presented as inevitable. The only question was whether I would make the process easier or more difficult for everyone involved. During this period, I also began to notice how they managed information and communication in ways that isolated me and increased my dependence on their interpretation of events. Phone calls from other family members or friends would mysteriously not get through to me, or I'd learn days later that people had tried to reach me. When I questioned these communication failures, Hiroshi and Rebecca would express concern that I was becoming paranoid or suspicious about normal technical problems. "Mom, your phone has been acting up for weeks," Rebecca would say when I mentioned missed calls. "You've been complaining about poor reception and calls not coming through. Maybe it's time to think about upgrading to a newer model, or at least letting us help you manage important communications so nothing falls through the cracks." They began inserting themselves into my relationships with medical providers, service professionals, and even casual acquaintances. Rebecca would call my doctor's office to clarify information from my appointments, ostensibly to make sure I'd understood instructions correctly, but actually to position herself as my primary contact for medical communication. Hiroshi would speak to repair technicians or service providers on my behalf, explaining that I sometimes became confused about details and asking them to coordinate with him rather than me directly. These interventions were always presented as helpful assistance that would reduce stress and confusion for me, but their actual effect was to gradually transfer control of my external relationships to them, making me increasingly dependent on their interpretation of events and their management of my interactions with the outside world. The psychological impact of this sustained manipulation was profound and frightening. Despite knowing intellectually that I was mentally sharp and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, I began to doubt myself in ways I'd never experienced before. When you're constantly told that your memory, judgment, and perception are unreliable, you start to question your own experiences and conclusions. I found myself second-guessing decisions I'd made confidently for decades. Did I really remember that conversation correctly, or was my recollection confused? Was my irritation with their suggestions a reasonable response to unwanted interference, or was I being unreasonably defensive about legitimate concerns? Were the problems they identified actually more serious than I realized, or were they manufacturing crises to justify their involvement? The self-doubt was particularly insidious because it fed on itself. The more I questioned my own perceptions, the more confused and uncertain I became. And the more confused I appeared, the more justified their interventions seemed to outside observers who didn't understand the manipulation that was creating my distress. But fortunately, my 40-year career as an educator had taught me to recognize manipulation tactics when I saw them. I dealt with parents who tried to gaslight me about their children's behavior, administrators who used psychological pressure to force compliance with unreasonable demands, and colleagues who employed subtle undermining techniques to advance their own interests at others' expense. The realization that my own family was using these same tactics against me was devastating, but it was also clarifying. Once I understood what was happening, I could stop blaming myself for the confusion and distress I'd been experiencing. I wasn't losing my mental capacity. I was being systematically manipulated by people who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to make me doubt myself. The evidence I'd gathered over those weeks of careful observation painted a clear picture of a sophisticated scheme designed to isolate me from support systems, undermine my confidence in my own capabilities, and position Hiroshi and Rebecca as the responsible decision-makers who needed to take control of my life for my own good. But what they didn't realize was that their target had spent decades developing the analytical and organizational skills necessary to recognize manipulation and build a case against it. They thought they were dealing with a confused, helpless elderly woman. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd chosen to target someone with both the intelligence to understand their game and the resources to fight back effectively. The pattern was now completely clear to me, documented in detail, and ready to be used as evidence of the systematic elder abuse they'd been perpetrating for over a year. The question now was how to use that evidence most effectively to protect myself, expose their scheme for what it truly was.
Now comes the part of my story that I'm most proud to tell. How I turned the tables on my manipulative family and reclaimed not just my assets, but my dignity and independence. What happened next would teach Hiroshi and Rebecca that underestimating a 73-year-old retired teacher was the biggest mistake they could have made. Armed with weeks of documented evidence and a clear understanding of their manipulation tactics, I knew I needed professional help to protect myself effectively. But I also knew that if I was going to take on my own family in what would essentially be a legal and financial battle, I needed allies who understood elder abuse and had experience dealing with sophisticated manipulation schemes. My first call was to Margaret Whitfield, a family law attorney who had been recommended by my longtime friend, Grace Patterson. Margaret specialized in elder law and had built her practice around protecting seniors from financial exploitation. When I called her office and explained that I needed to discuss potential elder abuse by family members, she scheduled an appointment for the very next day. Walking into Margaret's law office on Pine Street in downtown Portland, I felt more nervous than I had in years. This wasn't just about protecting my money. I was about to formally accuse my own son of theft and manipulation, a step that would forever change our family dynamics. But as I sat across from Margaret's desk and began telling my story, her professional outrage at what I described gave me the confidence to proceed. "Mrs. Nakamura," Margaret said, after I'd finished recounting the key incidents and showing her my documentation, "what you're describing is a textbook case of financial elder abuse combined with psychological manipulation designed to establish grounds for guardianship. The systematic way they've contacted people in your network to build a case for your incompetence is particularly concerning and legally problematic for them." She explained that Oregon had strong elder abuse laws that made both the financial theft and the psychological manipulation serious legal matters. The unauthorized withdrawals from my account, even though Hiroshi was a joint holder, could be prosecuted as theft because they had been obtained through deception. The campaign to convince others that I was mentally incompetent, while knowing I was not, could be considered elder abuse under state statutes. "We have several options," Margaret continued, pulling out a legal pad to take notes. "We can pursue criminal charges, civil litigation to recover the stolen funds, or we can use the threat of legal action to force them to stop their behavior and return what they've taken. Given that this involves your son and you have grandchildren to consider, I'd recommend starting with a comprehensive legal demand that demonstrates we have evidence of their crimes and gives them an opportunity to make things right without destroying the entire family." I appreciated her sensitivity to the family dynamics involved, but I also wanted to make sure that Hiroshi and Rebecca faced real consequences for what they'd done. "I don't want them to think they can just return the money and continue trying to manipulate me," I told her. "They need to understand that what they've done is serious and can't be repeated." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "We'll structure this in a way that protects you going forward while giving them a chance to avoid criminal prosecution if they comply fully with our demands. But if they refuse or try to retaliate against you, we'll have everything documented and ready for criminal referral." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret and I developed a comprehensive strategy that would not only recover the money they'd stolen, but also establish clear legal boundaries to prevent future manipulation. She worked with a private investigator to document the full extent of their scheme, contacted everyone they had approached with lies about my mental state, and prepared legal documents that would shock them with the scope of evidence we'd gathered. But I wanted to do more than just protect myself. I wanted to expose their manipulation in a way that would make it impossible for them to continue their scheme or target others in the future. That's when I came up with an idea that Margaret initially thought was too risky, but eventually agreed was brilliant. I was going to invite them to Sunday dinner at my house, just like we'd been doing for years. But this time, I was going to have Margaret and the private investigator present as new friends I'd made at a senior center.
I would let Hiroshi and Rebecca walk into a trap of their own making, giving them enough rope to hang themselves with their own lies and manipulation tactics. The Sunday I chose for this confrontation was November 15th, exactly 1 month after I'd overheard Mika's devastating phone conversation. I called Rebecca and invited them for our usual family dinner, mentioning casually that I'd made some new friends recently and hoped they wouldn't mind if I included them. "That's wonderful, Mom," Rebecca had said, her voice dripping with the false enthusiasm I now recognize so clearly. "We're always happy when you're making social connections. It's so important for people your age to stay engaged with others." I spent the morning preparing Kenji's favorite meal, teriyaki salmon, with steamed rice and vegetables from my garden. As I cooked, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. This would likely be the last family dinner we'd ever share, but it was necessary to protect myself from people who had shown they were willing to destroy me financially and emotionally for their own benefit.
Margaret arrived at 4 p.m., followed by James Murphy, the private investigator she'd hired to document their scheme. I introduced them as Margaret Wilson and James Patterson, friends I'd met at the Millfield Community Senior Center. To complete the illusion, I'd actually visited the center several times over the past 2 weeks to establish my cover story. "It's so nice to meet Beatrice's family," Margaret said warmly as Hiroshi and Rebecca arrived with Mika and Daniel. "She talks about you all the time. You're clearly very close." I watched Hiroshi and Rebecca carefully as we gathered in the living room for our usual pre-dinner conversation. They were both slightly suspicious of the newcomers, but trying to be polite. Rebecca, in particular, kept glancing at Margaret with the calculating look she got when she was trying to assess someone's potential usefulness or threat level. "Mom mentioned she's been spending time at the senior center," Hiroshi said, settling into his usual chair. "We're glad she's getting out and meeting people. We worry about her being isolated here in this big house all by herself." And there it was, the first manipulation, delivered right on schedule. Margaret and James exchanged subtle glances, having been briefed on exactly what to expect. "Isolated?" Margaret responded, with perfectly feigned confusion. "Beatrice seems to have a very active social life. She's one of the most engaged people at the center." "Well, she likes to stay busy," Rebecca said with that patronizing smile I'd learned to hate. "But at her age, it's important to have structured activities and supervision. Living alone isn't really safe anymore." James leaned forward with interest. "Supervision? Is Beatrice having health problems?" I sat quietly, letting them dig their own graves with the lies they couldn't seem to stop telling, even to strangers. "Not health problems exactly," Hiroshi said, exchanging one of those meaningful looks with Rebecca that I'd seen so many times before. "More like confusion issues, memory problems. She's been having trouble managing basic things like finances and home maintenance." "That's so surprising," Margaret said, her voice full of genuine amazement. "She handles the treasurer position for our center's book club, does all the math in her head, and keeps perfect records." The silence that followed was deafening. Hiroshi and Rebecca had just been caught in a fundamental lie by people who had no reason to cover for me or misrepresent my capabilities. "Well," Rebecca said slowly, "she has good days and bad days. Sometimes she seems fine, but then she'll do something that shows she's not really processing things clearly." "Like what?" James asked innocently. Rebecca glanced at Hiroshi for support before launching into a litany of the supposedly concerning behaviors they'd been using to justify their intervention. I was supposedly forgetting to pay bills, getting confused about medications, making poor decisions about home maintenance, and becoming increasingly paranoid about people trying to help her. Every word she spoke was being recorded by James's concealed device, with their full consent. After all, they thought they were talking to friendly strangers who would sympathize with their burden of caring for a difficult elderly relative. "It's so hard when parents reach this stage," Margaret said. "Have you considered what legal arrangements might be necessary? Power of attorney, perhaps?" Hiroshi's eyes lit up at the opening. "Actually, yes. We've been trying to convince Mom that it would be in her best interest to let us help manage her affairs.
She's resistant, but we're concerned that she's going to make serious mistakes if someone doesn't step in soon. The house alone is worth $750,000, Rebecca added, apparently unable to resist sharing financial information with virtual strangers. If she makes poor decisions about property management or falls victim to scams, the whole family could lose everything she and her husband worked for. I felt sick listening to them discuss my assets so casually, as if my life's work was already theirs to manage and protect. But I also felt vindicated. They were revealing exactly the attitude toward my money that I'd suspected all along. "Have you consulted with attorneys about the process?" James admitted. "We've done some preliminary research. The key is documenting her incapacity so that a judge will agree that intervention is necessary." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "And I assume you've been careful to create that documentation?" "Oh, yes," Rebecca said eagerly. "We've spoken to her doctor, her neighbors, friends from church, everyone who interacts with her regularly. Most people don't realize how serious the situation is because she's learned to hide her confusion pretty well." They continued for another 20 minutes, detailing their systematic campaign to convince my entire social network that I was mentally incompetent. They described their strategy for taking control of my assets, their plans to sell the house and move me to assisted living, and their belief that they were entitled to manage my money because I was no longer capable of making sound decisions. All of it was being recorded. All of it demonstrated their knowledge of my actual mental competence, combined with their deliberate deception of others. All of it proved that their claims about acting in my best interest were lies designed to cover their financial motivations. When we finally moved to the dinner table, I could barely eat, despite having spent hours preparing the meal. I was watching my son and daughter-in-law reveal themselves as people I didn't recognize, people who were capable of elaborate deception and manipulation for financial gain. After dinner, as Rebecca was helping clear the dishes, I decided it was time to spring the trap.
"Rebecca," I said quietly, "could you help me get something from the study? I have some papers I'd like Margaret to look at." She followed me into the study, where I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder containing all the documentation Margaret and I had prepared over the past 2 weeks. "What's this about, Mom?" Rebecca asked, but something in my expression must have warned her that the evening was about to take a different turn. "It's about the $4,200 you and Hiroshi have stolen from my checking account over the past 6 months," I said calmly, "and the systematic campaign you've been running to convince people I'm mentally incompetent so you can take control of my assets." The color drained from Rebecca's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't? Then perhaps you can explain why you told Mrs. Martinez that I wander around outside at unusual hours and seem confused about what day it is, or why you asked Grace Patterson to help convince me to move to assisted living because I'm too stubborn to accept that I need help." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The elaborate justifications and explanations that came so easily when she thought I was confused and helpless suddenly abandoned her when faced with someone who clearly understood exactly what had been happening. "The people you've been lying to for the past year aren't here tonight," I continued. "The woman you thought you could manipulate and control isn't here either. But Margaret Wilson and James Patterson are very real, and they've been documenting every word you and Hiroshi have said this evening." I opened the study door and called out to the living room. "Margaret, James, could you join us, please? I think it's time we had that conversation we discussed." Margaret and James entered the study, their friendly demeanor replaced by professional seriousness. Margaret pulled out her business card and handed it to Rebecca. "Mrs. Nakamura, I'm Margaret Whitfield, attorney at law, specializing in elder abuse cases. Mr. Patterson here is a licensed private investigator. We've been documenting your systematic financial and psychological abuse of your mother-in-law for the past month." Rebecca stared at the business card as if it might burst into flames. This is a setup." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "Just like the setup you and Hiroshi have been running on me for the past year. Except mine is legal, and yours constitutes multiple felonies under Oregon state law."
By this time, Hiroshi had joined us in the study, his face pale with growing realization that their scheme had been discovered and documented. The children, thankfully, were in the living room watching television and unaware of the confrontation taking place. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. This is a formal demand for the immediate return of all funds taken from Mrs. Nakamura's accounts without authorization, plus interest and penalties. It also requires that you cease all contact with people in her social network for the purpose of spreading false information about her mental capacity. She handed copies of the document to both Hiroshi and Rebecca, who read through the first few pages with expressions of shock and growing panic. Additionally, Margaret continued, we have documented evidence of your systematic manipulation and financial exploitation of Mrs. Nakamura. If you do not comply fully with the terms of this demand within 10 business days, we will file criminal charges for elder abuse, theft, fraud, and conspiracy. James stepped forward with his own folder. We have recorded conversations from this evening in which you admitted to deliberately misleading medical professionals, neighbors, and friends about Mrs. Nakamura's mental condition. We have bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals totaling over $4,000. We have documentation of your research into power of attorney procedures and assisted living facilities, combined with your own admissions that these plans were motivated by access to your mother-in-law's assets. Hiroshi finally found his voice. Mom, we can work this out. We're family. We don't need lawyers and private investigators in a family matter. We stopped being family the moment you decided to steal my money and destroy my reputation to get your hands on my house, I replied, my voice steady despite the heartbreak I felt. You made this a legal matter when you began committing crimes against me. Rebecca was crying now, but I felt no sympathy for her tears. We never meant to hurt you, she said. We thought you needed help, and we were trying to figure out the best way to provide it. You thought I needed help? I asked. Or you thought you needed my money? Margaret consulted her notes. According to the recording from this evening, you mentioned that the house is worth $750,000 and that you were concerned the whole family could lose everything if Mrs. Nakamura made poor financial decisions. That suggests your primary concern was protecting assets you considered yours rather than ensuring Mrs. Nakamura's well-being. We have your own words recorded this evening with your full consent, admitting that you've been systematically contacting people to build a case for Mrs. Nakamura's incompetence despite knowing she was mentally sound. This meets the legal definition of conspiracy to commit elder abuse.
The legal demand Margaret had prepared was comprehensive and devastating. It required immediate repayment of all stolen funds, a cease and desist order preventing any further contact with people in my social network, written apologies to everyone they had lied to about my mental state, and agreement to a restraining order that would prevent them from attempting to gain any legal control over my affairs. If you comply with these terms, Margaret explained, we will not file criminal charges. If you refuse, or if you retaliate against Mrs. Nakamura in any way, we will immediately turn this evidence over to the district attorney's office for prosecution. Hiroshi and Rebecca asked for time to consult with their own attorney, which Margaret agreed to with the understanding that their response was due within 10 business days regardless of their legal consultation. As they prepared to leave that evening, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief that surprised me with its intensity. The family dinners, the holiday celebrations, the grandparent relationship I'd cherished, all of it was probably over forever. But the constant stress, manipulation, and gaslighting that had been poisoning my life for the past year was also ending. "Mom," Hiroshi said as they gathered the children and prepared to go, "I know you're angry, but we love you. We really were trying to help. If you loved me, I wouldn't have spent the past year stealing my money and trying to convince everyone I know that I'm losing my mind. Love doesn't look like what you've been doing to me." Over the next week, I waited to see how they would respond to our legal demand. Margaret had warned me that they might try to retaliate by escalating their claims about my mental incompetence or by attempting to turn other family members against me, but she'd also assured me that the evidence we'd gathered was so comprehensive that
any such attempts would only strengthen our case for criminal prosecution. True to form, Rebecca made one last attempt at manipulation by calling my cousin Janet in Sacramento to report that I had become paranoid and was making false accusations against family members who were only trying to help. But Janet, who had known me for over 60 years, was not fooled by Rebecca's performance. Beatrice has always been one of the sharpest people I know. When Rebecca said you were becoming confused and suspicious, my first thought was that someone must be giving you good reason to be suspicious. On day 8 of the 10-day deadline, Margaret received a call from Hiroshi and Rebecca's attorney indicating that they would comply with all terms of our legal demand. Within 2 weeks, every penny they had stolen was returned to my account with interest. Written apologies were sent to everyone they had contacted with false information about my mental state, and agreement to a restraining order that would prevent them from attempting to gain any legal control over my affairs. The most satisfying part of the resolution came 3 months later, when I learned about the natural consequences their scheme had created for their own lives. Word of their attempted elder abuse had spread through their social circles, damaging their reputations in ways that would take years to repair. Rebecca's employer, a dental practice that served many elderly patients, had terminated her employment when they learned about her involvement in financial exploitation of a senior family member. Hiroshi's accounting firm, which also worked with many elderly clients, had placed him on administrative leave pending their own investigation into his trustworthiness with vulnerable populations. The children's private school had received reports about the family's financial problems and questionable ethics, leading to awkward questions and social ostracism that forced them to transfer to public school mid-semester. Most importantly, the house they had coveted so desperately remained firmly under my control, protected by legal safeguards that would prevent any future attempts to manipulate me into signing away my rights or assets. 6 months after that confrontational dinner, I was living a life that felt more authentic and peaceful than anything I'd experienced since Kenji's death. I remodeled my kitchen with money from my own savings, planted a new rose garden in honor of Kenji's memory, and begun volunteering at the literacy program at Millfield Community Center. I also started dating Harold Chen, a retired teacher from Portland who had lost his wife around the same time I'd lost Kenji. We met at a grief support group that I had joined, not because I was confused or incompetent, but because I was a healthy person processing loss in constructive ways. Harold appreciated my intelligence, my independence, and my sense of humor in ways that reminded me what it felt like to be valued for who I was rather than what I owned. The relationship with my grandchildren was the most complicated part of the aftermath. Mika and Daniel had been confused and hurt by the sudden end to our regular family gatherings, and they'd been told by their parents that Grandma Beatrice was going through a difficult time and wasn't ready to see family right now. I decided to address the situation directly by writing age-appropriate letters to both children explaining that their parents had been taking money from me without permission and telling lies about me to other people, and that I'd had to take legal action to protect myself. I assured them that I loved them deeply and that when they were older and could make their own decisions about relationships, I would welcome them back into my life.
Mika, now 17 and more capable of understanding adult complexities, reached out to me 6 months later. She wanted to hear my side of the story and to rebuild our relationship independent of her parents' manipulation and control. Our first coffee meeting was awkward, but it was also the beginning of a new and more honest relationship built on mutual respect rather than family obligation. As I write this story for you now, exactly 1 year after I overheard that devastating phone conversation, I'm sitting in my beautifully renovated kitchen in the house that Kenji and I built together, and that no one will ever be able to take away from me again. I'm 74 years old, financially secure, mentally sharp, physically healthy, and surrounded by people who value me for exactly who I am. The people who tried to convince the world that I was a confused, helpless elderly woman learned that I was actually someone with the intelligence to recognize manipulation, the resources to fight back effectively, and the courage to stand up for myself even when it meant confronting my own family.
I share this story not for sympathy, but as a warning and a source of hope. Elder abuse is real, sophisticated, and often perpetrated by the people who are supposed to love us most. But it's not inevitable, and it's not unstoppable. If you recognize the warning signs in your own life or in the life of someone you care about, know that there are resources, legal protections, and professional allies who can help. Most importantly, remember that age is just a number, and being older doesn't mean being helpless. I may be in my 70s, but I'm still the woman who raised 4 children, taught for 37 years, and rebuilt a house with her own hands. When someone threatened everything I valued most, I fought back and won. And if you're facing a similar situation, you can fight back and win too. Trust your instincts, document everything, seek professional help, and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less respect and dignity than you know you're worth. Now I'm curious about you who have followed my story to the end. Have you ever experienced financial manipulation by family members? Have you seen warning signs of elder abuse in your own family or community? What would you do if you discovered someone was systematically lying about your mental capacity to gain control of your assets? Comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if this story helped you understand the realities of elder abuse and family manipulation, please share it with others who might benefit from hearing about how one 73-year-old woman refused to become a victim and instead became a survivor who reclaimed her power and her life.